Sarah Martinez walked through the crowded downtown parking garage, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows between the rows of cars. She had just finished a late business dinner with potential investors for her nonprofit organization that provided scholarships for military families. The meeting had gone well, and she was looking forward to getting home to her quiet apartment. As she approached her silver sedan, Sarah noticed a large pickup truck parked so close to her driver's side that she could barely squeeze between the vehicles. She sighed, checking her watch. It was nearly 10 o'clock, and the garage was mostly empty except for a few scattered cars. "Excuse me, could you please move your truck a little?" she called out to the man, leaning against the vehicle next to hers. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, wearing a worn leather jacket and jeans. His arms were crossed, and he had been watching her approach with an unsettling smirk. The man didn't move. Instead, he pushed himself off his truck and stepped closer to her. "What's the magic word, sweetheart?" His voice carried a mocking tone that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Please," she said calmly, though her hand instinctively moved toward her purse where she kept her pepper spray. "I just need to get to my car." "You know what? I don't think I want to move it," the man said, his smirk widening. "Maybe you should learn some manners. Pretty little thing, like you shouldn't be so demanding." Sarah felt the familiar chill that came with recognizing a threat. Her years of training had taught her to read body language, to identify potential danger before it escalated. This man wasn't just being rude. He was testing her, seeing how far he could push. "I asked politely," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to leave." The man took another step forward, now standing uncomfortably close. Sarah could smell alcohol on his breath, mixed with cigarette smoke. His eyes had a glazed look that suggested he'd been drinking for a while. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said, his voice getting louder. "Walking around in your fancy clothes, acting all high and mighty. I bet you've never had to work a real day in your life." Sarah remained calm, though every muscle in her body was now alert. She had dealt with hostile situations before, though usually in very different contexts. "I don't want any trouble. Please just move your truck so I can leave." The man's expression darkened. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed a handful of her long dark hair, yanking it hard enough to jerk her head back. Sarah gasped, more from surprise than pain, though the sharp tug brought tears to her eyes. "Maybe this will teach you some respect," he snarled, tightening his grip on her hair. "You need to learn your place." For a moment, Sarah felt the old familiar surge of controlled anger that she had learned to harness over years of intensive training. But she also felt something else, a cold calculation that came from experience in situations far more dangerous than this parking garage encounter. The man holding her hair had no idea that the woman he was trying to intimidate had spent the last 8 years as a Navy SEAL team leader. He didn't know that she had led missions in some of the most dangerous parts of the world, that she had trained dozens of elite soldiers, or that she had earned commendations for actions that remained classified. Sarah had recently transitioned out of active duty, choosing to focus on her nonprofit work and adjust to civilian life. She had been enjoying the peaceful routine of business meetings and fundraising events. But as this stranger's fingers twisted in her hair, muscle memory began to take over. "Let go of me," she said quietly, her voice taking on a different quality, still calm, but with an edge that hadn't been there before. The man laughed, apparently misinterpreting her controlled tone as fear. "Or what? You gonna call for help? Nobody's around to save you, princess." He was wrong about that. Sarah didn't need saving. What she needed was for this situation to end without anyone getting seriously hurt. She had learned long ago that the best way to handle bullies was to give them exactly one clear warning before taking action. "I'm going to ask you one more time," she said, her training automatically adjusting her stance slightly, preparing her body for movement while appearing completely still. "Please let go of my hair and move your truck." The man's grip tightened, and he leaned closer to her face. "I don't think you understand the situation you're in, sweetheart. You're not in charge here. I am." Sarah looked directly into his eyes, and for just a moment, something in her expression made him hesitate. There was a stillness about her that didn't match the helpless victim he thought he was dealing with. But the alcohol, clouding his judgment, prevented him from recognizing the warning signs. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Sarah's right hand moved with precision born from thousands of hours of training. She struck the pressure point on his wrist with exactly the right amount of force to make his fingers involuntarily release her hair. Simultaneously, she pivoted her body, using his forward momentum against him as she swept his legs and guided him down to the concrete floor of the parking garage. Before the man could fully process what had happened, he found himself on his back with Sarah kneeling beside him, one knee positioned precisely over his solar plexus. Her hand was pressed against his throat, not choking him, but making it very clear that she could if she chose to. The entire encounter had been so smooth and controlled that to an observer, it might have looked like an elaborate dance move rather than a combat technique. "Listen carefully," Sarah said, her voice perfectly calm despite what had just occurred. "I tried to handle this politely. I asked you nicely to move your truck and to let go of my hair. You chose to escalate this situation, not me." The man stared up at her with wide, shocked eyes. The alcohol haze was rapidly clearing as adrenaline flooded his system. He tried to speak, but could only manage a strangled sound. "I'm going to stand up now," Sarah continued. "You're going to move your truck, and then you're going to drive home and sleep off whatever you've been drinking. Are we clear?" She applied just enough pressure to emphasize her point, and the man nodded frantically. Sarah stood up gracefully, stepping back to give the man room to get to his feet. He scrambled up awkwardly, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. His eyes darted around the parking garage, as if looking for witnesses to what had just happened, but they remained alone under the flickering fluorescent lights. What are you?" he stammered, rubbing his throat where her hand had been positioned. The cocky smirk was completely gone, replaced by a mixture of fear and bewilderment. "Someone who really just wanted to go home," Sarah replied, smoothing down her business suit and checking her watch again. She picked up her purse, which had fallen during the brief confrontation, and slung it over her shoulder with the same casual motion she might use after a routine meeting. The man stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. The petite woman in the professional outfit looked completely normal again, showing no signs of having just taken down someone nearly twice her size. Her breathing wasn't even elevated. "You're military," he said suddenly, recognition dawning in his voice. "You're military, aren't you?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, considering how much to reveal. "I was. Now please move your truck so I can leave." Instead of immediately complying, the man took a step closer, his expression shifting from fear to curiosity. The alcohol was still affecting his judgment, preventing him from recognizing that he should probably just do as she asked and leave. "What branch?" he pressed. "Army? Marines? You don't look big enough to be infantry." Sarah felt a flicker of annoyance. Even after what had just happened, he was still making assumptions about what she could or couldn't do based on her appearance. It was a frustration she had dealt with throughout her military career, people seeing a 5'6" woman and underestimating her capabilities. "Navy," she said simply, hoping that would satisfy his curiosity. "Navy." The man's eyebrows raised. "Like on a ship? What did you do? Handle communications or something?" Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had heard variations of this question countless times. People assumed that women in the Navy must have been in support roles, communications, medical, administrative. They rarely guessed that she might have been in combat operations. "Something like that," she said, reaching for her car door handle. But the man moved to block her path again. "Wait, hang on," he said, his manner shifting to something that might have been intended as friendly. "I'm sorry about before. I've had a rough day, you know? Lost my job this morning, and I've been drinking. That's not an excuse," but he trailed off, apparently expecting some kind of sympathetic response. Sarah studied his face, noting the red-rimmed eyes and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested this wasn't his first day of heavy drinking. "I understand you've had a difficult day," she said carefully, "but that doesn't give you the right to intimidate strangers in parking garages." I know, he said, holding up his hands in what was probably meant to be a placating gesture. But seriously, what you just did, that was incredible. Where did you learn that? Sarah realized that he wasn't going to let this go easily. Some people, when confronted with something outside their understanding, became obsessively curious. She glanced around the parking garage again, confirming they were still alone. Special operations training, she said finally. Now, please move your truck. The man's eyes widened. Special ops? Like SEALs? Sarah didn't answer, but something in her expression must have confirmed his guess because his mouth fell open. Holy shit, he breathed. You're a Navy SEAL? Was, Sarah corrected. I'm retired. The man stared at her with something approaching awe. I didn't even know women could be SEALs. We can, Sarah said simply. And I was. For 8 years. The reality of what he had tried to do was clearly sinking in. The man took several steps back, his face pale despite the alcohol flush. Jesus Christ. I grabbed your hair. I actually grabbed a Navy SEAL's hair. Sarah almost smiled at the expression of horror on his face. Yes, you did. And now you know why that was a poor decision. The man ran his hands through his hair, looking increasingly agitated. My dad was a Marine. He always talked about SEALs like they were superhumans or something. He said they could kill someone with their bare hands. We're trained to neutralize threats, Sarah said matter-of-factly. But we're also trained in de-escalation and proportional response, which is why you're standing here having a conversation instead of waking up in a hospital. The man swallowed hard. You could have really hurt me. Yes, Sarah agreed. But I didn't want to. I just wanted you to let go of my hair and move your truck. Those goals haven't changed. For a moment, they stood in silence as the man processed this information. Sarah could see him mentally replaying the last few minutes, probably wondering how differently things could have gone. What kind of missions did you do? He asked suddenly. Sarah shook her head. I can't discuss operational details. Much of what I did remains classified. But you saw combat? Yes. The man seemed to be struggling with something. He looked down at the ground, then back up at her face. I feel like an idiot. You should, Sarah said bluntly. You tried to intimidate someone based on nothing but your own assumptions and your need to feel powerful. That's the behavior of a coward. The words hit him like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, Sarah saw genuine shame in his expression. You're right, he said quietly. I'm a coward. I lost my job today because I couldn't handle the pressure. 12 years at the same company, and they laid me off because I couldn't adapt to the new systems. Made me feel worthless. So I came out tonight and drank myself stupid, and then I saw you, and he trailed off. And you decided to take out your frustration on someone you thought couldn't fight back, Sarah finished. Yeah. The admission came out as barely more than a whisper. Sarah studied his face, seeing the genuine remorse there. In her years of leadership, she had learned to recognize when someone was truly processing their mistakes versus when they were just sorry they got caught. What's your name? She asked. Marcus, he said, looking surprised by the question. Marcus Coleman. Well, Marcus Coleman, Sarah said, you have a choice to make. You can let this be a learning experience, or you can go home and feel sorry for yourself until you're right back here next week, looking for someone else to blame for your problems. Marcus nodded slowly. What would you do? If you were me? Sarah considered the question. I'd stop drinking first of all. Then I'd figure out what skills I needed to develop to become more valuable in the job market. And I'd probably volunteer somewhere, doing something that helped other people to remember that the world doesn't revolve around my problems. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You know what the crazy thing is? I almost joined the Navy when I was 18. Always regretted not doing it. It's never too late to serve, Sarah said. There are plenty of ways to help your community that don't require military service. The man nodded again, seeming to really consider her words. Can I ask you something? Sarah glanced at her watch again. This conversation had already gone on much longer than she had intended. One question. Why didn't you hurt me worse? I mean, I grabbed you. I was being threatening. You could have really messed me up, and nobody would have blamed you. Sarah was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer. Because the goal isn't to hurt people, Marcus. The goal is to stop the threat and get home safely. I accomplished that without causing permanent damage to either of us. That's a win. Marcus stared at her with something that might have been wonder. My dad always said that the mark of a true warrior was knowing when not to fight. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. Marcus's voice was soft. He died 2 years ago. Lung cancer. He would have been ashamed of how I acted tonight. Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy for the man. Grief could make people do stupid things, and losing a parent often left people feeling lost and angry at the world. Then, don't give him any more reasons to be disappointed, she said gently. Make choices that would make him proud. Marcus nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. Yes, ma'am. Without another word, he turned and walked to his pickup truck. Sarah watched as he climbed into the driver's seat and carefully backed the vehicle away from her car, leaving her plenty of room to get in. As she opened her car door, Marcus rolled down his window. Thank you, he called out, for not breaking my neck and for, talking to me like a person instead of just some drunk asshole. Sarah paused with one foot in her car. Everyone deserves a second chance. Marcus, don't waste yours. She watched him drive away before settling in her own car and starting the engine. As she pulled out of the parking garage, Sarah reflected on the encounter. It wasn't the first time her military background had come as a surprise to someone, and it probably wouldn't be the last. Most people saw what they expected to see, a small woman in business attire who looked like she belonged in a boardroom, not a battlefield. Sometimes that worked to her advantage, as it had tonight. The element of surprise had allowed her to end the confrontation quickly and with minimal force. But she also knew that not every encounter would end so peacefully. There would always be people who refused to back down, who let their pride or anger override their common sense. Those situations required different approaches, and Sarah had been trained for all of them. As she drove through the quiet city streets toward home, Sarah found herself thinking about Marcus Coleman and wondering if their conversation would actually make a difference in his life. She had seen men in similar situations before, lost, angry, looking for someone to blame for their problems. Some of them found their way back to a better path. Others spiraled further into destructive behavior. She hoped Marcus would choose the former path, but ultimately that choice was his to make. 3 weeks later, Sarah sat in her small home office, reviewing applications for her foundation's latest scholarship program. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of her downtown apartment, illuminating stacks of paperwork and her laptop screen. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her former teammate, Chief Petty Officer Jake Morrison, asking about their monthly meetup. These gatherings had become a tradition since Sarah's retirement 6 months ago. A small group of her former SEAL team members who were also transitioning to civilian life would meet for coffee to check in on each other. The adjustment from military to civilian life wasn't always easy, and having that support network made all the difference. Sarah's path to the Navy SEALs had been anything but traditional. Growing up in a small town in Colorado, she had been a competitive swimmer and martial artist before joining the Navy at 19. What started as a way to pay for college through military service had evolved into something much more significant when she learned about the opportunities opening up for women in special operations. The training had been the most challenging thing she had ever attempted. Out of the 23 women who had started the selection process with her, only 4 had made it through the initial phases. Sarah had been the only one to complete the full program and earn her Trident pin. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan, where she quickly proved herself as a valuable team member. Her small stature actually became an advantage in certain situations. She could move through spaces that larger operators couldn't, and targets often underestimated her until it was too late. Over 8 years, Sarah had deployed to 7 different countries, leading missions that ranged from hostage rescue to reconnaissance operations. She had earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Navy Cross for actions that she wasn't allowed to discuss with anyone outside the special operations community. The decision to retire hadn't been easy. Sarah loved the work and the brotherhood of the teams, but she had also seen too many good people burn out from the constant deployments and high-stress operations. When her father had suffered a heart attack the previous year, she realized she wanted to be available for her family while also doing something meaningful with the skills and leadership experience she had gained. Starting the foundation had given her a new sense of purpose. Providing educational opportunities for military families felt like a natural extension of her service, and she had discovered that she enjoyed the challenge of fundraising and program development almost as much as she had enjoyed operational planning. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed her assistant's name. Jennifer Saransuarat. What's up? I have someone here who says he needs to speak with you urgently. Jennifer's voice carried a note of concern. He won't give me his full name, just says to tell you it's Marcus from the parking garage. He says you'll know what that means. Sarah felt a mix of surprise and wariness. She had given Marcus her business card that night, telling him to contact her if he ever wanted information about volunteer opportunities. But she hadn't really expected him to follow through. Is he agitated or threatening in any way? She asked. No, actually he seems nervous. Very polite. He's just sitting in the waiting area, but he keeps saying it's important that he talks to you. Sarah considered her options. Her instincts told her that Marcus probably wasn't dangerous. Their encounter 3 weeks ago had seemed to genuinely affect him. But she also knew better than to ignore her security protocols entirely. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. If his behavior changes at all, call building security. Will do. Should I tell him you're coming? Yes, but don't give him any details about when I'll arrive. Sarah gathered her things and drove to the Foundation's small office building downtown. As she walked through the lobby, she could see Marcus sitting in the waiting area through the glass doors. He looked different than he had that night. Cleaner, more alert, and considerably more nervous. Jennifer met her at the reception desk. He's been here for about an hour, she whispered. Very polite, but he keeps checking his watch and looking at the door. Any idea what he wants? He just keeps saying he has information you need to know. Something about that night you met. Sarah nodded and approached Marcus. He stood up immediately when he saw her, almost knocking over his coffee cup in his haste. Ms. Martinez, he said, his voice slightly shaky. Thank you for seeing me. I wasn't sure you would. What's this about, Marcus? Sarah asked directly. You said it was urgent. Marcus glanced around the waiting area, noting that Jennifer was still within earshot. Is there somewhere we can talk privately? It's about what happened in the parking garage, but it's also about something bigger. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception or instability. What she saw was genuine anxiety mixed with what appeared to be determination. Follow me, she said, leading him to a small conference room. Once the door was closed, she gestured for him to sit across from her at the table. I've been sober for 3 weeks, Marcus said without preamble. Haven't had a drink since that night. Started going to meetings, got a sponsor, the whole thing. That's good to hear, Sarah said. But I'm guessing that's not why you're here. Marcus shook his head. No, it's not. Something happened yesterday that I think you need to know about. It involves a guy who fired me from my job. Sarah waited for him to continue. My boss, Richard Castellanos, owns a construction company. Medium-sized operation, about 50 employees. I worked there for 12 years, mostly as a project supervisor. Marcus paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. The reason he fired me wasn't really about adapting to new systems, like I told you. That was part of it, but the real reason was because I found out about something illegal. What kind of illegal? Sarah asked. He's been skimming money from a federal contract. Road construction project funded through the Department of Transportation. Richard figured out how to inflate the costs and pocket the difference. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Construction fraud involving federal contracts was something she had encountered during her military service, particularly in overseas operations where contractors have been stealing money meant for infrastructure projects. Did you report this to anyone? Marcus looked uncomfortable. I tried to talk to Richard about it first. Thought maybe he just didn't understand the regulations. But he made it clear that if I want to keep my job, I needed to keep my mouth shut. When I refused to sign off on falsified invoices, he fired me. And you've been dealing with this stress by drinking, Sarah said, understanding now why Marcus had been in such a destructive state that night. Yeah, I felt like a coward for not fighting harder, you know? 12 years with the company, and I just let him push me out rather than making waves. Marcus met her eyes. But after talking to you, after thinking about what you said about making choices that would make my dad proud, I decided I couldn't just let this go. So what happened yesterday? I went to the FBI field office. Spent 4 hours telling them everything I know about Richard's operation. They're opening an investigation. Sarah nodded approvingly. That took courage. Maybe. But here's the thing. When I was talking to the FBI agents, your name came up. Sarah felt a sharp spike of alertness. My name? How? They asked me about my current mental state, whether I was reliable as a witness. I told them about that night in the parking garage, about how you talked me through my problems and convinced me to get sober. I mentioned that you were former military. And Marcus leaned forward. One of the agents, Agent Patricia Wells, asked me more questions about you. What branch, what her name was, stuff like that. When I told her you were Navy Special Operations, she got really interested. Started asking if I knew anything about your current work. Sarah's mind was racing now. FBI interest in her background could mean several different things, none of them necessarily good. Did you tell them about the foundation? I gave them your business card, yeah. But Agent Wells made it sound like they already knew about you. Like they'd been looking for a way to make contact. Looking for a way to make contact about what? Marcus shook his head. They wouldn't tell me. But Agent Wells asked me to give you a message. She said to tell you that the Kandahar investigation has been reopened, and they need to speak with you as soon as possible. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Kandahar. She hadn't heard that word in an official context for over 2 years. The operation in question had been one of her most classified missions. A hostage rescue that had gone sideways when they discovered the real target was a high-value asset involved in international arms trafficking. Did she say anything else? Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. Just that it was urgent and that you should contact her directly rather than going through normal channels. She gave me her card to give to you. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. Sarah took it, noting the FBI seal and Agent Wells' contact information. Marcus, Sarah said carefully, I need you to understand that this conversation never happened. You came here to update me on your sobriety, nothing more. Can you do that? Marcus nodded seriously. I owe you that much and more. If you hadn't talked sense into me that night, I would never have had the courage to go to the FBI about Richard's fraud. You probably saved my life. Sarah stood up, the business card feeling heavy in her hand. You save your own life by making the right choices. I just reminded you that you had choices to make. As Marcus prepared to leave, he turned back to her. Is everything okay? You look worried. Sarah managed a small smile. Nothing I can't handle. Take care of yourself. Marcus, stay sober. After he left, Sarah sat alone in the conference room, staring at Agent Wells' business card. The Kandahar operation had been officially closed after an extensive debriefing process. For the FBI to reopen an investigation after 2 years meant that new evidence had come to light, or that someone involved in the original incident had started talking. Either possibility could be dangerous for her and for the other members of her former team. Some operations left loose ends that took years to surface, and when they did, the consequences could be severe. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed Agent Wells' direct number. Whatever this was about, she needed to know sooner rather than later. Her days of avoiding difficult situations were over, both in the military and in civilian life. The best approach was always to confront problems head-on. The phone rang twice before a professional voice answered. Agent Wells, this is Sarah Martinez, Sarah said. I understand you've been looking for me. Agent Patricia Wells was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp brown eyes and the kind of direct manner that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Denver that Wells had chosen, a busy place with enough ambient noise to mask their conversation and multiple exits in case either of them needed to leave quickly. Thank you for contacting me so promptly, Wells said as they settled into a corner booth. I know this must come as a surprise. The Kandahar operation was thoroughly debriefed and closed, Sarah said without preamble. What's changed? Wells opened a manila folder and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table. Sarah recognized the face immediately. Dmitry Volkov, a Russian arms dealer who had been their primary target during the Kandahar mission. Volkov was arrested 3 months ago in Prague on unrelated charges, Wells explained. During his interrogation by Czech authorities, he started talking about American Special Operations personnel he claimed had stolen money from one of his weapons shipments. Sarah studied the photograph, remembering the chaos of that night in Afghanistan. The mission had been intended as a simple hostage rescue. 3 aid workers had been kidnapped by what intelligence suggested was a local Taliban cell. But when her team had breached the compound, they had discovered something much more complex. The weapons shipment he's referring to was evidence, Sarah said carefully. We secured according to protocol and turned it over to military intelligence. That's what your after-action report states, Wells agreed. But Volkov is claiming that the shipment contained more than just weapons. He says there were bearer bonds worth over $2 million hidden in false compartments. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. Bearer bonds were essentially untraceable cash. Whoever physically held them could claim their value. If Volkov was telling the truth about the bonds being in that shipment, and if they had disappeared, it would look like her team had stolen them. I never saw any bearer bonds, Sarah said honestly. We cataloged everything we found and turned it over to Major Stevens from military intelligence. If there were bonds, he would have them. Wells nodded, making notes. Major Stevens died in a helicopter crash 8 months ago in Iraq. Before his death, he was under investigation for misappropriation of seized assets from multiple operations. The pieces were starting to fit together in a very uncomfortable way. If Major Stevens had been stealing from seized shipments, and if Volkov's bonds had been among his targets, it would explain why the arms dealer was now talking to law enforcement. So Stevens was dirty, and now Volkov is trying to use that information to leverage his own situation, Sarah said. That's our working theory. But the problem is that Volkov's story is very detailed. He knows things about your mission that weren't included in the public reports. He knows about the layout of the compound, the number of team members involved, even some of your tactical decisions during the operation. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. Someone with access to classified information has been talking to him. Or someone who was actually there, Wells said quietly. The suggestion hit Sarah like a physical blow. Wells was implying that one of her own team members might have been in contact with Volkov, possibly even conspiring with him from the beginning. That's impossible, Sarah said firmly. I know these men. I've served with most of them for years. They would never compromise an operation or work with arms dealers. I hope you're right, Wells said. But we have to investigate every possibility. Volkov has offered to provide additional information about American personnel involved in what he calls unauthorized asset recovery in exchange for consideration on his current charges. Sarah stared at the photograph of Volkov, trying to remember every detail of their brief encounter in Kandahar. The arms dealer had been wounded when they found him in the compound, apparently shot by his own people during whatever dispute had led to the hostages being taken. He had been conscious but dazed, and she remembered thinking he seemed more concerned about something in the shipping containers than about his injuries. He kept asking about the cases, Sarah said suddenly. When we found him, he was trying to drag himself toward the shipping containers. He kept saying something about cases that needed to stay together. Wells leaned forward. Cases? Plural? Yes. We thought he was referring to weapons cases, but maybe he meant something else. There were dozens of crates and containers in that compound. We couldn't examine all of them in detail during the operation. What was your team's procedure for handling seized materials? Everything went through Major Stevens. He had a team of intelligence specialists who cataloged and processed everything we brought back. My team's responsibility ended once we handed materials over to them. Wells made more notes. How well did you know Stevens? Sarah considered the question. We worked with his unit multiple times, but I wouldn't say I knew him personally. He seemed competent, very interested in the details of what we recovered. Maybe too interested, in hindsight. What do you mean by that? Most intelligence officers I worked with were focused on actionable information, documents, communication devices, things that could help with ongoing operations. Stevens always seemed more interested in valuables. Jewelry, cash, anything that might have monetary value. And you never found that suspicious? Sarah shook her head. Asset recovery was part of his job. Seized valuables were supposed to be cataloged and either returned to rightful owners or used to fund intelligence operations. I assumed he was just being thorough. Wells pulled out another document. We've been investigating Stevens' activities over the past 2 years. He appears to have been systematically skimming from seized assets across multiple operations. Conservative estimate puts his theft at over $5 million. $5 million. Sarah's voice reflected her shock. How is that possible? Bearer bonds, untracked cash, precious metals, artwork. Stevens had access to a lot of valuable items that were difficult to trace. He would report lower values than actual worth, keep the difference for himself. Sarah felt a surge of anger. Her team had risked their lives on those operations, believing they were serving their country and protecting innocent people. To discover that someone had been using their efforts for personal profit was infuriating. So why is the FBI involved? Isn't this a military matter? It became our jurisdiction when Stevens started selling some of the stolen items to civilian buyers in the United States. We've traced purchases of stolen artifacts and precious metals to dealers in 3 different states. Wells paused, studying Sarah's face. There's something else. Stevens kept detailed records of his activities, probably as insurance in case he was caught. Those records include specific information about team members involved in operations where assets went missing. What kind of information? Financial records, mostly bank account numbers, investment portfolios, unusual purchases, or deposits. Stevens was apparently paranoid about someone discovering his activities and potentially threatening him. Sarah felt a chill of apprehension. Are you saying he was investigating my team members? Among others, Stevens compiled files on dozens of special operations personnel. Most of them probably have no idea they were being monitored. Wells pulled out a thick folder. This is Stevens' file on you. Sarah stared at the folder without touching it. The idea that someone had been secretly compiling information about her personal life was deeply unsettling. What's in it? Financial records going back 3 years, information about your family, details about your retirement planning, even records of your foundation's funding sources. Wells paused. Stevens was very thorough, but he didn't find anything suspicious because there's nothing to find. That's correct. Your financial records are exactly what we'd expect from someone living on military pay and benefits. Stevens' notes indicate that he couldn't find any evidence of unexplained income or assets. Sarah felt some relief, but also growing anger. So he was investigating all of us, looking for evidence that we were involved in his theft operation. It appears that way. Stevens might have been planning to implicate team members if his activities were discovered, create confusion about who was actually responsible for the missing assets. The implications were staggering. If Stevens had been successful in pointing suspicion towards special operations teams, it could have destroyed the careers and reputations of dozens of innocent personnel. Agent Wells, Sarah said carefully, what exactly do you need from me? Complete cooperation with our investigation. We need detailed information about every operation where your team worked with Stevens' unit. We need to know about any unusual behavior you observed, any conversations about assets or valuables, anything that might help us understand the full scope of his activities. And in return? In return, we clear you and your team members of any suspicion and focus our investigation on the real criminals, Stevens' network of civilian buyers, and any military personnel who were actually involved in the theft operation. Sarah nodded slowly. What about Volkov? What happens to his claims about my team stealing his bonds? If we can prove that Stevens was responsible for the missing bonds, Volkov's testimony becomes worthless. He was clearly trying to blame American personnel for something Stevens stole. Wells leaned back in her chair. There's one more thing you should know. We have reason to believe that Stevens wasn't working alone. Someone with continued access to classified information has been in contact with several of the civilian buyers, providing updated intelligence about ongoing investigations. Someone currently in the military? Or recently retired with maintained security clearances. Someone who knows how our investigation is progressing and has been warning Stevens' associates. Sarah felt a new wave of concern. Are you saying my team members are still under suspicion? Some of them. Stevens' files included detailed information about several personnel, including speculation about their potential involvement in his activities. We need to investigate those leads, even if we believe they're false. Wells gathered her papers. I'm going to give you a list of team members we need to speak with. I'd prefer if you could facilitate those interviews rather than us approaching them directly. It would be less disruptive to their lives and careers. And if I refuse to cooperate, Wells met her eyes directly. Then, we'll conduct the investigation without your help, which will probably be more disruptive for everyone involved. Volkov's accusations have already been shared with the Department of Defense. This investigation is happening whether you participate or not. Sarah understood the message clearly. She could either help control the process and protect her team members, or she could let the investigation proceed without her input and potentially watch innocent people get caught up in a bureaucratic nightmare. I'll need to contact the people on your list, Sarah said. Some of them might want to have legal representation present during interviews. That's their right. But I hope you'll emphasize that cooperation with our investigation is the fastest way to clear their names and move on with their lives. Wells stood up, leaving the folder with Stephen's information about Sarah on the table. Take that with you. Review it, and let me know if you notice anything unusual or inaccurate. Sometimes subjects notice discrepancies that investigators miss. As Wells prepared to leave, Sarah had one more question. Agent Wells, why did you approach me through Marcus Coleman? Why not contact me directly? Wells smiled for the first time during their conversation. Frankly, we weren't sure how to approach you without raising suspicions. Your foundation work gave us a cover for making contact, but we needed to be careful. When Coleman mentioned his encounter with you and your military background, it provided a natural opportunity. So you were already investigating me when Marcus came to you about his boss's fraud? We were investigating Stephen's associates and anyone who might have information about his activities. Your name came up as files, so we needed to determine whether you were a victim of his surveillance or a potential co-conspirator. Wells gathered her things. For what it's worth, everything we've learned about you suggests you're exactly what you appear to be, an honorable veteran trying to make a positive difference in civilian life. I hope this investigation confirms that assessment. After Wells left, Sarah sat alone in the coffee shop, staring at the folder containing Stephen's surveillance records. The violation of privacy was infuriating, but more concerning was the realization that this investigation could drag on for months, potentially affecting not just her own life, but the lives of her former teammates. She thought about the men she had served with, wondering which of them were on Wells' list of people to interview. These were soldiers who had risked everything in service to their country, and now they were being investigated because a corrupt intelligence officer had tried to frame them for his own crimes. Sarah opened the folder and began reading Stephen's notes about her life. The level of detail was unsettling. He knew about her family, her retirement plans, even her decision to start the foundation. Reading his clinical observations about her personal life felt like being violated all over again. But as she read, Sarah began to notice patterns in Stephen's surveillance methods. He had been systematic about collecting information, but he had also made assumptions and drawn conclusions that weren't always supported by the evidence he had gathered. If Stevens had applied the same flawed methodology to investigating her teammates, there might be errors in his assessments that could help clear innocent people more quickly. Sarah closed the folder and pulled out her phone. She had calls to make and people to warn. This investigation was just beginning, and she needed to make sure her team was prepared for what was coming. 2 months later, Sarah stood in the same coffee shop where she had first met Agent Wells, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Wells sat across from her with a satisfied expression and a stack of documents that represented the conclusion of their investigation. Stephen's entire network has been shut down, Wells announced. 12 civilian buyers arrested, 3 military personnel charged with conspiracy, and over $8 million in stolen assets recovered. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. And my team members? Completely cleared. In fact, your cooperation was instrumental in helping us understand Stephen's methods and identifying the real conspirators. The investigation had been more complex than anyone had initially realized. Stevens hadn't just been stealing from individual operations. He had been running a sophisticated network that included military personnel at different bases, civilian appraisers who undervalued seized assets, and buyers who specialize in moving stolen goods through seemingly legitimate channels. What about Volkov? Sarah asked. Wells smiled grimly. His information about the missing bearer bonds was accurate, but his claims about American personnel being involved were completely false. Stevens had indeed stolen the bonds from the Kandahar shipment, and we found them in a safety deposit box registered under one of his false identities. So Volkov was telling the truth about the theft, but lying about who was responsible. Exactly. He was trying to reduce his own sentence by providing information about American corruption, but he didn't actually know who had taken his bonds. He just assumed it was the team that had captured him. Wells pulled out a thick report. This is the final documentation of our investigation. Your team's actions during the Kandahar operation were not only professional and appropriate, they actually helped us identify one of Stevens' largest thefts. Sarah shook her head in amazement. So we've been under investigation for 2 months because we did our jobs correctly. Welcome to federal law enforcement, Wells said with a wry smile. Sometimes doing everything right still makes you a suspect until we can prove you're innocent. The investigation had been stressful for everyone involved. Sarah had spent countless hours being interviewed, providing documentation, and helping to facilitate conversations between the FBI and her former teammates. Several of her team members had needed to take leave from their current positions while the investigation was ongoing, and one had nearly lost a civilian job due to the security concerns. But the process had also revealed information that was deeply satisfying. Stevens' network had been responsible for stealing from military operations across multiple theaters, robbing funds that were meant to support ongoing missions and aid local populations. There's something else, Wells said, pulling out another document. Remember Marcus Coleman, the man who first put us in contact? Of course. How is he doing? Very well, actually. His information about his former boss's construction fraud was completely accurate. Richard Castellanos was arrested last week on federal charges of defrauding government contracts. Coleman's testimony was crucial to building the case. Sarah smiled. I'm glad he followed through on reporting the fraud. He did more than that. Coleman has been sober for over 2 months now, started a new job with a legitimate construction company, and has been volunteering with a veterans organization. Wells paused. He asked me to give you a message. What's that? He said to tell you that he's making choices that would make his father proud. Sarah felt a warm sense of satisfaction. Sometimes the most important victories weren't the dramatic ones that made headlines, but the small personal triumphs that changed individual lives for the better. Agent Wells, Sarah said, I have to ask, when you first approached me, did you really think my team might have been involved in Stevens' operation? Wells considered the question carefully. Honestly, we couldn't rule anyone out initially. Stevens had been very careful to create documentation that could implicate others if his activities were discovered. But after reviewing your records and interviewing your team members, it became clear that you were all exactly what you appeared to be. Professional soldiers doing a difficult job with honor and integrity. And yet you had to investigate us anyway. That's the nature of these cases. We have to follow every lead, even when our instincts tell us that certain people are innocent. It's the only way to ensure that the real criminals are caught and that innocent people are definitively cleared. Wells gathered her papers. There is one final matter. The Department of Defense has asked me to convey their apologies for the disruption this investigation caused to your lives and careers. They've also asked me to inform you that commendations for your service during the operations affected by Stevens' activities will be reviewed and potentially upgraded. Sarah was surprised by this news. Upgraded how? I can't give you specific details, but apparently your team's actions during several operations, including Kandahar, were more significant than was reflected in the original reports. Stevens may have deliberately downplayed your contributions to minimize attention on operations where he was stealing assets. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Stevens' efforts to cover up his crimes had inadvertently hidden the true extent of her team's achievements. There's one more thing, Wells said. The FBI has been impressed with your cooperation during this investigation and your transition to civilian life. We'd like to explore the possibility of you consulting with us on future cases involving military personnel or operations. What kind of consulting? Cases where we need someone who understands military culture and operations, but who also has the civilian perspective to help us navigate complex investigations. Someone who can help us ask the right questions and interpret what we find. Sarah was intrigued by the possibility. Would this interfere with my foundation work? It would be part-time consulting, probably just a few cases per year. But your insights during this investigation were valuable enough that we'd like to maintain that relationship. As they prepare to leave the coffee shop, Wells had one final question. Can I ask you something personal? When Coleman grabbed your hair that night, were you ever tempted to hurt him more seriously than you did? Sarah thought about the question. For about half a second, yes. My training kicked in automatically, and neutralizing the threat was the immediate priority. But part of that training is also about proportional response and de-escalation. What made you choose de-escalation? Experience, Sarah said simply. I've seen what happens when people let anger or pride drive their decisions in confrontational situations. It rarely ends well for anyone involved. Coleman was drunk and stupid, but he wasn't evil. He just needed someone to remind him that he had better choices available. Wells nodded thoughtfully, and if he had continued to escalate, then I would have stopped him with whatever force was necessary, Sarah said matter-of-factly. But the goal is always to use the minimum force required to resolve the situation safely. As they walked out of the coffee shop together, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night in the parking garage. A chance encounter with a drunk, angry man had led to an FBI investigation that cleared her team of serious accusations and resulted in the arrest of a major theft network. More importantly, Marcus Coleman had used that encounter as a turning point to rebuild his life, and Sarah had discovered a new way to serve her community through consulting work with federal law enforcement. Agent Wells, Sarah said as they reached their cars, do you think Stevens was planning to frame my team from the beginning, or was that just a backup plan in case he got caught? Wells considered the question. Based on what we found in his records, I think it was a backup plan. Stevens was primarily focused on stealing assets, not on destroying careers. But he was smart enough to realize that if his activities were discovered, he would need scapegoats to deflect suspicion. So we were just convenient targets. Unfortunately, yes. Special operations personnel handle a lot of valuable seized assets, and most people don't understand the protocols involved. It would have been easy for Stevens to create a narrative about operators keeping trophies or souvenirs for missions. Sarah shook her head. The irony is that most of us never even thought about the monetary value of what we were recovering. We were focused on the mission objectives, which is exactly why Stevens thought he could get away with blaming you. He assumed that honest people wouldn't even know enough about his activities to defend themselves effectively. As Sarah drove home, she thought about the lessons from the past 2 months. The investigation had been stressful and disruptive, but it had also been a reminder of the importance of maintaining integrity even when faced with false accusations. Her phone rang as she pulled into her apartment building's parking garage, the same garage where she had first encountered Marcus Coleman. The caller ID showed the number for her foundation office. Hi, Jennifer, Sarah answered. What's up? Great news, her assistant said excitedly. Remember that large anonymous donation we received last month? The donor has revealed his identity and wants to meet with you about expanding the foundation's programs. Oh, who is it? Marcus Coleman. Apparently, he received a whistleblower award from the Department of Transportation for reporting that construction fraud. He wants to donate a significant portion of it to the foundation and discuss setting up a program specifically for veterans dealing with addiction and employment issues. Sarah smiled as she parked her car in almost the exact same spot where she had parked that night 2 months ago. Sometimes life had a way of bringing things full circle in the most unexpected ways. Schedule the meeting, she told Jennifer. And Jennifer, make sure we have plenty of coffee. It's going to be a long but very productive conversation. As Sarah walked toward the elevator, she passed the spot where Marcus had grabbed her hair and changed both of their lives forever. The parking garage looked exactly the same, but everything else was completely different. She had learned that sometimes the most important encounters came when you least expected them, that doing the right thing often led to consequences you never could have predicted, and that the decision to help someone else could end up helping yourself in ways you never imagined. Most importantly, she had been reminded that the skills and values developed during military service, integrity, courage, and commitment to something larger than yourself, were just as valuable in civilian life as they had been on the battlefield. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped inside, ready to begin the next chapter of her story. Behind her, the parking garage returned to its quiet emptiness, giving no sign of the dramatic events that had unfolded there or the lives that had been changed forever by a single moment of choice between fear and courage, between escalation and compassion, between destroying someone and helping them find a better path forward. The foundation would grow, Marcus would continue his recovery, and find new purpose in helping other veterans. Agent Wells would solve more cases with Sarah's consulting help. And somewhere in a federal prison, Major Stevens would have plenty of time to reflect on how greed had destroyed not only his own career, but had threatened the reputations of the honorable soldiers whose service he had exploited. But in that quiet parking garage, under the flickering fluorescent lights, none of that future was visible. There was only the space where two strangers had met in conflict and discovered that even the most unpromising encounters could become the beginning of something better.